Do you really want movies to be scary? That might sound like a silly question, but I mean it. You could be the biggest fan of horror movies in the world. Do you still want a movie to scare you? The short answer is no. I don't think you do. People's dispositions to regular horror movies varies enough as it is. Many overlook the genre altogether because they don't want to be scared. Some people have phobias and avoid movies with specific things in them to not get scared. But even for those who like horror movies, I'd wager you're still making some kind of mental contract with yourself by enjoying them. You don't really think Pennywise can hurt you after watching it, do you? There are movies I call scary for one reason or another. Halloween, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Alien, The Exorcist. But in these cases, calling them scary is more like a reward for filmmakers doing a good job creating tension or atmosphere. It's hazy because I suppose some movies make you ponder their plausibility more than others, but everything that still scares you is still done for the sake of thrills. Being truly scared for your safety because of a movie is antithetical to why I think many people watch them. And this Halloween, I want to discuss a movie that I didn't think movies could even be this terrifying. Threads is a docudrama film that aired on the BBC network in 1984. It is about the events before, during, and after a global nuclear exchange between NATO and the Soviet Union, as seen from the perspective of the British town Sheffield. Since its release, Threads has been touted as perhaps the most bleak and realistic depiction of nuclear holocaust in cinema history. Of course, this was the peak of the Cold War, so it makes sense a movie like this would come around as some sort of reminder of mutually assured destruction. The detail to which it goes through every stage of what this would look like is masterful. It's not so simple as a big bomb going off and pockets of survivors left to pick up the pieces. It is a slow burn unraveling of what would cause such an event and how it would expose society's greatest weaknesses until we spiral into extinction. Threads is divided into two halves, split down the middle almost exactly by the bombs dropping. But not to get ahead of myself, Threads is dramatized but leans heavily on the objective tone of a documentary. We follow an ensemble of characters, but the film also has a narrator, and locations, dates, or other important information is often shown through text. It's unconventional presentation of a story, but I contend these things are deliberately unimmersive to remind the audience of the film's predictive, factual basis and not risk them getting lost in how these events are still fictional. Just one magnificent detail of Threads is the sound of, computer or typewriter keys whenever this text is shown. The way all the other noise drops out, to me, it cements the idea that these moments are little breaks in any semblance of a story to remind us of reality, like some unseen entity is relaying them to us, or recording them. The main character is Ruth, a woman recently engaged to her boyfriend Jimmy after a surprise pregnancy. The very first scene of them is the two sitting in a car near a cliffside discussing their future together. Yep. For a very brief half hour or so, this film is about them reacting to this pregnancy. They visit friends and family to discuss it. But sometimes there'll be, wherever they are at the moment, a news broadcast in the background detailing an escalating military conflict between the United States and Russia over the movement of nuclear weapons in Iran. This catches our characters' attention every time, and they'll even discuss it with whoever they're with, but they always return to what they were doing before. Even when the scene isn't directly about it, news of this distant conflict is always heard in the background. The film's approach to character is almost montage-esque. We're shown so many nameless people, from war protesters, to police, to shop clerks dealing with inflation. When the bomb drops, the number of characters shown is almost too big to keep track of. When people talk about this movie, there's a lot of calling characters like the woman who blank, or the man who does blank. This is a very purposeful move, and I'll explain why it's done later. But another important character we're introduced to a little bit later is Clive, a public official told to hide out in a makeshift bunker beneath City Hall with other intelligence members and public service persons as tensions get higher, and boy, how they do. The threat of actual nuclear conflict is first addressed around 20 minutes in, when the US confirms moving nuclear warheads into Iran as the conflict escalates. I should mention, we are never shown anything outside the town of Sheffield except through news footage, and any specific military stratagem are shown through text. The war actually turns nuclear in a brief one-warhead each exchange off-screen in Iran, and as time goes on we see protests, runs on grocery stores, people creating makeshift bunkers for themselves, unchecked inflation, gas stations closing down, blockading major roadways exiting the city, public broadcasts instructing people how to prepare for a nuclear strike, and, my personal favorite, the constant insistence people remain calm in spite of every indication the powers that be are scared of what's coming. Obviously, the increased police presence is a really big red flag, but they go so far as to evacuate the local fire engines because they'll be needed after the bombs drop. Mere seconds before Clive and the intelligence officers get the attack warning red message, they're talking about how warehouses of resources like sugar and wheat have been acquiesced by the police. So, even before the bombs drop, Threads doesn't shy away from what the world is probably going to look like before they do in real life. And the first reason why this movie is truly frightening, and why the rest of the movie is even more so, is because some of these things likely seem very familiar to you. I am not a channel which explicitly discusses politics, but it's difficult to not notice the similarities between Threads and the current situation in Ukraine or Taiwan. This is a choose-your-own-adventure apocalypse. When I say I'm not explicitly political, I mean that I'm not going to discuss whether Putin is unhinged enough to end up using nuclear force. But from where I'm standing, we're living the first act of Threads, where a potentially world-ending conflict only takes up the part of our day where we incidentally catch glimpses of it on the news or online. Then we're expected to just go about our day. And even scarier, we do. At least in the United States, I can speak for ongoing inflation. And check out this handy instructional video from just a few months ago by the New York City Emergency Management.
So there's been a nuclear attack. Don't ask me how or why, just know that the big one has hit, okay? So what do? Get inside fast. Step 3, stay tuned. Follow media for more information. Don't forget to sign up for Notify NYC for official alerts and updates. And don't go outside until officials say it's safe.
Obviously, this is not the first time we've been told to basically duck and cover and hope for the best. Threads is obviously speaking to its time, but that does not make this almost 40-year-old TV movie about imminent nuclear disaster still being relevant today any more comforting. This is what I was saying about a movie actually being scary, because it reminds you of your literal safety being at risk. It's one thing for a horror movie to be completely implausible, never gonna happen. Everything in Threads actually could. But hang on, Threads isn't the only movie about nuclear war, right? Well, there's plenty about stopping one, but about one that actually happens. There's gotta be a couple. Well, a year before Threads came out, 1983, there was a US contemporary counterpart called The Day After. Very similar film. The first act is all build-up, the second half is mostly aftermath. There's How I Live Now, which is a YA adaptation with a happy ending where everything's fine. So, I'm not even gonna talk about that one. Besides that, and a lot of B-movies which obviously don't do the topic dramatic justice, The Day After is the best comparison. And in this brief compare and contrast, the essential difference I want to highlight is The Day After playing out for the sake of dramatized structure. There's way more explicit characterization and focus on these individuals. After the bombing scene in The Day After, it isn't very long until you see people emerging from their shelter, maybe 2 minutes. And I get it, for a movie the plot has to move along, typically you want to see our character's next move. But Threads has 10 minutes of characters writhing in pain and vomiting because of fallout first. And when they finally do start wandering around, it gives you time to take in the charred remains of the city and absorb the gravity of what's happened. This is a constant technique used throughout the film, as Threads is toying with ideas greater than I think you can attach to any single person. But if it tries, the characters are usually propping up the ideas, not vice versa. Of course, I'm not trying to disparage The Day After. In fact, there are rumors that after the Reagan administration screened the film, it affected them so much it influenced future nuclear policy decisions. So if your measure of artistic success is real-world impact, it is entirely arguable that is the superior film. I just think the two movies have different priorities, and for me, one ends up much scarier than the other, on its own. The Day After's got Wayne Knight in it. I'm not going to be scared by a movie if at any point I'm thinking about Seinfeld. Eventually, the film really shifts from the kitchen sink drama with Ruth to a harder focus on her witnessing these signs of inevitable disaster. Thread's impersonal storytelling creates this initial distance between her and the viewer. But the dramatic irony of us knowing the bombs are coming catches up with Ruth as she breaks down in tears, scraping wallpaper off the wall. I think because it'd ignite in the explosion, they don't explain why. But this is one of those scenes, it's so simple, but it scares the shit out of me. Seeing her in this, moment of clarity, knowing what's about to happen and unable to brace herself. Maybe everyone's not as paralyzed with fear by nuclear war as I am, but scarier than any fear of something happening to a generically likable character is, like a switch, that initial distance closing and realizing you are the characters. And then it happens. We're taken through every stage of Sheffield getting nuked. An explosion over the North Sea kills the electricity before salvos start hitting Sheffield's production and military targets. And this is, unsurprisingly, the part of the film which is the most straightforward. You wouldn't think it, but the ensuing panic actually has the film's only moment of levity. A guy reacts to the flashes of light while on the toilet.
Hell.
And that's the most British way a person could possibly respond to a nuclear bomb. But I like that we see such diverse reactions. Many run and scream, but Jimmy's friend is in pure shock. The intelligence officials underground furiously map out the blast zone, and one businesswoman even urinates in fear. The effect right before the blast wave hits is kind of cheesy, but great at prodding the imagination at what exactly it's supposed to represent. And the sound dropping out as objects start to combust is just... it's perfect. When the blast wave hits, it's 2 straight minutes of buildings exploding, things on fire, including corpses and animals. And don't worry, in real life, the shot of this cat is just reversed footage of the little fella after some catnip. And for how much ground it covers in each stage of the bombing, I think it's pretty seamless and effective. And the sound design as well, it's a little like... Now, this is probably not something you were anticipating, but this scene is actually where a couple of my negative criticisms of Threads begin. I don't know what happens in a real nuclear explosion, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. Threads is a TV movie and had a relatively low budget. As a rule, it does so much better at working within the confines of that budget than most. The typed out text leaving things that don't necessarily need to be shown to our imagination is a way they actually use the lack of budget to make the film better. But there are limits to that, and they begin to show themselves when the question becomes how to show the full-scale effect of a nuclear bombing with that budget. If Threads came out today, they could just use CGI, but since they can't practically capture a convincing mushroom cloud on their own, that means shots of the explosions themselves is mostly stock footage. In all fairness, even Mad Max Fury Road uses nuke stock footage. That's why I really like the shots like this, where the explosion is visible from the Sheffield skyline. But technically, something like Terminator 2 gives a much more compelling visual of the explosion itself, and the effects of the nuke are, from my understanding, more immediate than shown here. And if you look at the destruction in Threads, you'll go from one building to stock footage of a completely different one being demolished, often disguising this with a snap zoom just before the cut. Upon rewatch, the aftermath half is full of black and white still images as establishing shots, for instance, the destroyed face of Ruth's home, way more than I thought it was. It's a masterpiece of low-budget filmmaking pushing the boundaries of effective editing and sound design, but sometimes they've put a transparent overlay of fire in the frame. Come on, that doesn't do the realism any favors. These little things don't make Threads not scary, because honestly, I don't even think this scene is supposed to be the scariest part. But it's weird to think that in a nuke movie, the scene where the nuke explodes is one of the least convincing parts. While not related to the bombing scene, my remaining criticisms, while much milder, apply to the rest of the film in the aftermath. Because of Thread's dedication to neo-realism, it rushes by a lot of important details in offhand remarks or by implication. Clive's wife, Marjorie, is implied to be dead when he asks whether a spot on the map is in the path of fallout due to the wind. But if you weren't paying attention, you'll probably miss that. And when the second half of the movie takes place in mostly indistinguishable, blown-out buildings, and people's faces are covered in ash, the further you go, the more places start to look the same. If you weren't really paying attention, you'll probably be saying, "Wait, who is that? Where is this?" a couple times. While I think Threads is an actual scary movie, I don't think it's totally infallible, that's all. So, because it's easy to lose track, here's every character and where they are. Jimmy's parents, the Kemps, are mostly immobile beneath an improvised cushion shelter. His mother is covered in burns and his father poisoned with radiation. Ruth and her family are in their basement, and Clive is stuck underground with the other intelligence officers. This is where Thread's bleakness really starts to pile up, and tonally you'll start to see the differences between it and other nuclear holocaust movies. As I said, it takes a while for the characters to even do so much as emerge from shelter. Instead, the film belabors Jimmy's parents slowly dying of radiation poisoning, and Ruth's family slowly running low on food. The genre here is speculative. So I get why the movies are naturally fixated on what the characters would do. How would they keep going? But I think this phenomenon should be looked at as movies' undeserved commitment to the human spirit triumphing despite all odds, which I'm going to unfairly assume is Spielberg's fault. Because in real nuclear winter, we would all do the same thing as the characters do in Threads. Nothing! No matter how f***ed you think humanity's gonna be after the nukes drop, Threads is here to assure you it'll be so much worse than you think. And there is nothing you could do to even nudge yourself any closer back to normalcy. I get the sense that with an additional 40 years of media depicting nuclear winter as more of a setback for humanity than its sudden, immediate end, Threads clearing up this misconception with its unrelenting hopelessness is more relevant than ever. While at times the film, going forward, can be a little one-note, two things really stand out to keep your attention: the production design and the acting. The sets are never gigantic, as was probably necessitated by the smaller budget, but this is where a lot of those stock or black and white photos do a lot of the immersive work. But what's there is convincingly the burned up rubble of nuclear aftermath. When it comes to the acting, this is not the kind of performance-oriented drama usually associated with good acting like Shame or There Will Be Blood. We see more commitment to neo-realist filmmaking in the casting process, because the filmmakers sought out unknown actors for both extras and principal roles. They felt a person's star power would distract from the film's plausibility. There's no plainer way to say it than it is completely believable these likely amateur actors are living after the apocalypse. The stress, exhaustion, anxieties, and sicknesses they'd be experiencing. Ruth in particular does a fantastic job. I'm honestly unsure if I've ever seen more realistic crying in a movie before. There's no music, ever, in this movie, and minimal non-diegetic noise at all. Large portions of the movie are dialogue-free simply because the characters wouldn't have anything to say to each other. The major deaths in the film are unceremonious and blunt, sometimes cutting back to them after having died off-screen. Those who remain are filthy, bandaged, bloodied, and uniformly miserable, which apparently was the lead criteria for how the extras auditioned. How miserable can you look? There's no way to describe the second half of Threads that'd illustrate how effective the bleakness is as narrative aesthetic better than just watching it for yourself. I dare say it is impossible to watch Threads as just a movie because of its provocative, almost anti-form pace and presentation. Like I said, Threads' approach to nuclear aftermath is a firm stance that there's absolutely no recourse for it, but it doesn't show how terrible everything is all at once and stew in it, but rather in sequence. In particular, it does this thing where just as you think things can't get worse, they do. After the intensity of the bombing scene and Ruth emerging from her shelter, it almost feels like the movie could end right there and you'd get the idea. Everything's destroyed, on fire, or irradiated. What's left to understand? The second half of Threads jumps ahead through time much more than the first. This lets the movie document the future side effects of the bombings realistically, but also, I suggest, highlight the finality of it all. And as you watch that time go by, seeing conditions only get worse lets the idea there truly is no going back take hold much easier. This theme of finality or futility includes actions people were already taking before the bombs dropped, like the hubris of believing this was something that could be adequately prepared for. The empty grocery store shelves, stockpiling of gasoline, the inflation, scraping off all your wallpaper. The nukes negate whatever motivation anyone involved in those things had. Because what does it matter if you, the shopkeeper, got 40p for some foodstuff instead of 26p when you survive the bombing with half your body burnt off and then die in a cholera outbreak? Mr. Kemp tries to get water from a dislodged sink, and even though some filthy water does at first come out, it stops before he can get a bowl, fill it, and bring it to his wife. He also later trades some cigarettes for scotch with another survivor, but is literally too diseased to even swallow it, then dies right there. Even the smallest thing that might make someone happy again for an instant is denied them. One scene with just such awful implications is Ruth drinking some bottled water, and her mom tells her to stop drinking so fast because
Ruth, be careful with that, love. You don't know how long it's going to have to last us.
As if a few sips of water is going to be the difference between whether or not they can hold out long enough to stick this out. It takes 1 second, but immediately plants in your head the message that there is no possible way you could have stored enough food for it to matter. You would have to be like John Goodman in 10 Cloverfield Lane to even hope of continuing a modestly livable life. And I prefer this approach, as opposed to, Don't Look Up, which over-explains and over-embellishes critiques of modern apocalyptic apathies. I like when a movie, especially one taking itself so seriously like Threads, lets you make these connections for yourself. I started to get misanthropic fumes from the film against characters demonstrating this ignorant hope. Before the blast wave hits in the bombing scene, Ruth's grandmother complains that Ruth's parents are leading her down the stairs too fast. And not to be ageist or insensitive, part of me was like,
"Bitch, there is a nuke outside!"
The way life and politics are shown to us in Threads, where society's on the brink of collapse but we still have time to be petty to a shopkeeper, or heaven forbid someone move you down the stairs fast enough to evade an atomic bomb, I got the vibe of like watching the rich passengers in Titanic as the ship sank. It made me wonder if Threads is so mean-spirited it thinks we deserve this. I wouldn't go that far, but there is this sense that nuclear war could never happen without certain ubiquitous societal attitudes. If we had any logic at all, whether British or American or Soviet, I think mutually assured destruction on this level would lead everyone in the country to slaughter their leaders at the mere thought of actualizing it. But it doesn't. Why? Furthermore, Threads says 3,000 megatons are exchanged between the East and West militaries. I'm no expert, but even if that number was halved in the event one side never even got to retaliate with their nukes, wouldn't everything still be fucked? In the months and years following the attack in Threads, we see global nuclear winter, fallout, followed by a thinned ozone layer. Would those things just not have happened at 1,500 megatons? And if destruction is so mutually assured your enemies don't even need to retaliate, the only reason a society would think about using them is, I guess, desensitization to what they're actually going to do. So, we might not deserve any of this, according to Threads, but it spares no one's ego saying this is the eventuality of a culture which has become so drunk on its own comfort, begetting complacency and ignorance to these things. Of course, the actual scary part being none of that, and instead how you can go out and see that culture in real life when you turn the film off. After the initial few days after the attack and the settling of radioactive fallout, Ruth wanders into the streets. 11 days after the attack, we see the onset of nuclear winter. The sun is blocked out, and temperatures become freezing or below for most of the day, although most can't even tell when daytime is anymore. Ruth is not the only person to come out of their shelter, though, and those people are hungry. When sieging the food stocks, survivors are warded off with gas attacks and even opened fire upon by police. And then we have the hospital scene. Which, to be real, I can't bring myself to watch anymore. It's a scene where hundreds of desperate, wounded people beg for medical care. The few living medical personnel try to assist who they can, even though they've no resources to do that. The ground is saturated with blood, dirty equipment, and bodies. I don't know what the hell this is. Pus? Seeing the staff pushed to such insane measures as ripping bedsheets for improvised bandages, mixing table salt with water as their only disinfectant, and operating without anesthesia and just a regular-ass Home Depot saw, all the while set against the cacophonous screams of every patient, was, it's a bit much. It's the one scene in the film so brutal and grim and disgusting. Every time I get to it, I've elected against subjecting myself to the emotions I felt watching it the first time. There's a shot of the stairwell running with blood and unidentifiable debris. All I could think was how crowding so many people together in such conditions definitely spread way more disease than could have ever been cured here. Now, maybe not everyone's brain works this way, but watching this scene, I'm also reminded that there have probably been situations that are exactly like this in real life. Take the earthquake in Haiti from like a decade ago. The hospitals probably looked like this. Threads might be dramatized, but it isn't fiction. By now, you may have asked yourself, why is this movie called Threads? Well, the hospital scene holds the key. About the lack of medical resources, the narrator has this to say.
By this time, without drugs, water or bandages, without electricity or medical support facilities, there is virtually no way a doctor can exercise his skill. As a source of help or comfort, he's little better equipped than the nearest survivor.
And the movie begins with footage of a spider spinning its web with this narration.
In an urban society, everything connects. Each person's needs are fed by the skills of many others. Our lives are woven together in a fabric, but the connections that make society strong also make it vulnerable.
See, so many of our modern skill sets are interconnected and empowered by others. In the case of these doctors, without medical equipment and medicine, the efficiency of their skill set against these kinds of injuries ends at diagnosis. Think of just how many professions would cease to exist without power or transportation, communications, agriculture. Threads is about how that synergy is so delicate and made us so comfortable we're ignorant to how little it could take to undo. These threads have convinced us we are beyond destroying ourselves. The fixation on characters we see for only one scene or one shot is to greater emphasize that interdependence we have. Everyone we see in the film's collage of characters is a thread, drawing attention to their individual actions weaving together to form the collective. After the hospital scene, we're shown that in the absence of food stock distribution, survivors have taken up looting, to which the police and government are having trouble containing with, no prisons. Except they don't give the food back that was being stolen, they take it for themselves. You see, they need that food to make people work. Those who participate in reconstruction work are given food, and this is where we see Mr. Kemp trade for the scotch before succumbing to his sicknesses. 4 weeks after the attack, we're introduced to the traffic warden with a bandaged face on the poster. The first time I watched this movie, I was like, I wonder what that guy's story is. And that was it. After this, he's not in the film anymore. Even with 10 seconds of screen time, the traffic warden is the most iconic image associated with the film, and for good reason. Of all the follies and futilities in the film, perhaps the biggest one is made by the unseen rulers of the British Empire, pretending a semblance of old order is still possible. And to do this, they will press down as hard as possible with intimidation and authoritarianism. What sense does it make to try and control looting in a world with no future? But the traffic warden represents, so long as you're the one on the right side of the fence with a gun slung over your shoulder, it doesn't need to make sense. As Ruth and the other survivors engage in a mass exodus from the city, an airplane flies overhead telling them to return home. An airplane. In addition to a scarcity of food, another stockpiled resource Threads restates over and over is dwindling is fuel, and yet the government is happy to spend what little they have flying planes so they can tell survivors to follow their command. Food, vehicles, the confiscated local fire engines never see their way back to the people, despite that being the supposed reason for hoarding them. It doesn't elaborate on special courts of justice given wide-ranging powers, but to me it sounds like a bureaucratic it, saying no holds barred if it means denying the government has no control anymore, and there is no person, resource, or tactic they will not expend so long as the last thing to die out about old society is exploitation of the commoner. Periodically in this part of the movie, we'll cut back to Clive and the intelligence officers trapped in the basement of City Hall. They've been buried beneath a mountain of rubble, waiting for someone higher up to send a team and dig them out. And we get to see the attitudes these people in charge have towards the survivors above.
They're all gonna die on that patch anyway.
Round here, 50% will still be alive, but here, they're as good as dead already.
A lot of people are going to die anyway.
Look, what's the point of wasting food on people who are going to die anyway?
I agree with Clive.
Well, I don't know. Look, shoot the buggers, I don't care!
People just didn't stock up.
How could they? The bloody shops were empty.
And now they're coming out of the shelters. I know it sounds callous, but I think we should hang on to the little food we've got.
Now, Threads is clever about this, because the buried officers are just in charge of Sheffield. They are not federal-level officers. And this means that as this guy is talking about hoarding their food supply and distributing it is a lost cause, chances are someone who is on a federal level at some point made the same call about them. 1 month after the attack, Sheffield City Hall has finally been dug out, the excavation crew finding every member of the Sheffield Committee dead of suffocation. If you want a portrait of futility, the greediest among us, using all they could keep for themselves, didn't even last a month. Now, Clive's death and the civilian exodus kind of mark a new sort of chapter to the aftermath. The climax of the film beginning 4 months after the attack and suggesting the level of suffering we've just seen is a constant for extended periods of time. The estimated death count in Britain is now 17 to 38 million. The depleted food stocks mean humanity's only hope is a successful harvest season, but even with some still functioning equipment, the conditions of nuclear winter render that impossible. Most, if not all, of the young and elderly are dead of malnutrition or cold by the end of the first winter. A full year after the attack, sunlight returns, but with increased UV light causing an increase in cataracts and leukemia. Sun exposure with this concentration of UV rays also does more harm than good to agricultural efforts, and with no pesticides or fertilizer, the second harvest is little more than maggot-ridden scraps. 3 to 8 years after the attack, the population has fully regressed to medieval levels. 10 years after, survivors are continually bound to toil in a basic, unreliable agrarian dependency. Ruth, prematurely aged, collapses in the field, and is finally put out of her misery, dying in her bed. Depending on the source, plot synopses will say she's blinded by cataracts and disagree on what of many possible diseases killed her, but the film doesn't actually confirm any of this because it doesn't care. But wait, Brian from the channel Brian, you might say, what about Ruth's baby? She was pregnant. Surely she gave birth in the 10 years after the attack. Yes, she did, my eagle-eyed, vigilant, hypothetical viewer. Sometime before that first winter season after leaving Sheffield, we see Ruth in this nice little Grapes of Wrath shot before giving birth, forced to sever the umbilical cord with her teeth. This is her daughter, Jane. The first generation who will only know post-apocalypse is here. With no education, these youths only speak in broken English. After Ruth dies, we follow Jane for the final 5 minutes of the film. There's a weird scene where Jane and other kids watch like an educational VHS tape. I don't know if this is some kind of improvised school, because the kids also do crafts, I guess. And there's an old woman who could be a teacher. 13 years after the attack, Jane is seen looting with 2 boys and then raped in a fight over food. There's a reason we're following Jane instead of Ruth to the end of the film. You see, children and babies represent new life. And this is yet another recurring theme of Threads. Yes, the film begins framing Ruth's arc around her pregnancy, but there's so much more to it. Before she gives birth, Ruth will once or twice stare wordlessly at a child survivor. After Jane is born, there's this scene taking place in front of an advertisement for Standard Life Assurance, featuring a baby. When Jimmy initially says he's trying to reach Ruth during the bombing scene, the cries of a child can be heard, even though there's no baby on screen.
Ruth! This is all right!
After the teenage Jane is introduced to us, some still images imply forms of primitive industry may be returning. But children or babies are long associated with bloodline, progress, and carrying on new life. Juxtaposing these tentative steps into old modernity with Jane's introduction is meant to bait you into believing there might be one little bit of life goes on messaging the film has to offer. But if you've watched up to this point, you should know better. This baby motif is certainly there, but that's not because Threads sees it as the exception. It was just saving it for last. Presumably, 9 months later, Jane stumbles into a makeshift hospital, saying, "Baby's coming" in her broken English. One more subtle indicator technology is, to some degree, returning. Look at that. They have electricity here. Jane delivers her baby, but we never see it. The sight of the second-generation nuclear child is implied to be so deformed it's too much for Jane to stomach, and her screams are cut off by a freeze frame. Human reproduction has been severed at the root. It's a fitting end. A scream we never hear by someone who can't even articulate their terror. So, do you really want movies to be scary? With a film like Threads, I think I've made it clear it's not just witnessing the sequence of events that makes it scary. It's not just what we will experience when the bombs drop for real, it's why we'll experience it, what it says about everyone you meet. It's the little ideas that stick in your head that this depth of hopelessness and futility can be called upon at any time against your will. And in case I haven't made it clear, obviously no shame if horror of any kind is just not your thing, or if you enjoy the way horror movie villains thrill you, but Freddy Krueger is not scary the same way as Threads. What's scary is the truth that there is no such thing as complete autonomy or safety, because at any moment you and everyone you know could be wiped out by a mad politician's spur-of-the-moment inclination, and the human race and their history will die in agony with you. It's so bewitching, because I know there's the underlying wish we'd not be so foolish as to let something like this happen. I believe most people want to find something amidst the suffering in this film that can still be done, no matter what, engendering the sense that there just has to be some detail you missed, saying there's some kind of hope, and when it gets to the end with Jane holding that baby, you'll always be convinced it's gone. Maybe I'm just completely wrong, and you don't find this scary at all for some reason. I don't know. I'm not you. Maybe you just aren't as afraid of nuclear war as I am. Whatever your tangible fears are, I hold fast that we generally don't want movies contributing to a greater sense of helpless unease within us. The trick is, even if we don't want it, maybe movies like Threads serve another purpose than our wants. Realizing how real these predictions of the future are to me, it builds character. If the filmmakers get their way, nuclear war will never break out. They seem to think it will because people are desensitized to that possible reality, a phenomenon that will be eliminated if the film is successfully far-reaching. That discomfort is what makes me call it essential cinema. But I'm still unlikely to ever be like, hey, what's a fun movie to put on for the evening? How about Threads? I think never watching things which make you truly scared shows you're not interested in art presenting you with risk. Gone Girl scares me because if I'm lazy and apathetic, I could become Nick Dunn. Synecdoche, New York scares me because it demonstrates the ease of slipping into a life without purpose. Being truly scared by art is actually a good thing, even if you don't want to be. It proves you're not disaffected. It proves you care about something in life. Threads scares me too. Did you know that an hour before the first plane hit the World Trade Center on September 11th, Ray Romano and Peter Boyle were being interviewed about the season 6 premiere of Everybody Loves Raymond. It was as ordinary a day as you could imagine, and so too will be the day the bombs drop. And it's okay that I know that. You may never see this video because the bombs dropped in between me filming and uploading it. You might be the last person to ever watch it because they drop as soon as you're done. You might never hear me say this sentence because they drop 10 minutes into you watching the video. Who knows?